In fact, if you stopped it, you'd close down all the newspapers and academic publications. It's all over them. It's extreme incitement to hatred, to violence, to great crime. The alleged concern about incitement to racial hatred is very narrow. It does not apply to the major cases. We should think about that. Should incitement to racial hatred be tolerated? No, it shouldn't be tolerated. Nor should incitement to war be tolerated. Or all sorts of other speech should not be tolerated. But there's a gap, crucial gap, between not tolerating something and granting the state the power to determine what speech is legitimate, or even worse, to determine what are historical truths. I don't think we should grant the holy state the right to decide what history is, and to punish deviation from it, and to decide what kinds of statements are legitimate and what kind aren't. I don't want the state to have that power. So no, sure, don't tolerate it, but don't grant the state the right to determine what's acceptable and to punish it. That's a critical gap, which unfortunately is not made clear in Europe, I'm afraid. What about an insult to the dead? Say, Holocaust denial. I mean, the worst form of insult to the dead that I can think of is to adopt the principles of their murderers. Goebbels and Stalin would be delighted with the Gauches law in France, you know, which is allegedly trying to protect the memory of the dead. It's not, it's insulting them. You don't insult the memory, you don't honor the murdered victims of the Holocaust by adopting Nazi doctrines. And that is the doctrine that the state does have the right to determine historical truth and other legitimate expression, to punish deviation from it. Actually, I just add a personal note. One of my close friends died a couple of years ago, was Israel's leading civil rights activist, civil and human rights activist, Israel Shahat, as some of you may know. He was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto and Bergen-Belsen. Somehow survived, made it to Israel, became the leading figure in defense of human and civil rights, Palestinian rights, women's rights, homosexual rights, and so on. He was quite respected in Israel. He was selected for honors on Holocaust Day. One day a year they picked a Holocaust victim. His conclusion from his experiences was, yes, never again for anybody, not just for me, but for anybody. So that kind of thing shouldn't happen to anyone, not just to me and my friends. That's the right kind of conclusion to draw, I think, from this horrible repression. Now, I don't know Belgian law, so maybe I'm wrong, but I would guess that if I stood up right now and said here that King Leopold didn't kill 10 million people at the Congo, that he only killed 5 million, or if I said that the Belgian government didn't purposely murder Lumumba and throw the Congo into total disaster, including what's happening right this minute, namely the worst atrocities in the world being carried out with the cooperation of multinational corporations in eastern Congo so that you can have cell phones. If I were to deny that, I doubt that I'd be brought to court. You can tell me if I'm wrong. I suspect that that's pretty serious. These are some of the worst crimes in modern history, and they reach right to this minute. They're going on right now while we're talking in eastern Congo, which is the worst atrocities in the world, all traceable to these activities or recent activities. Well, that again illustrates a very, I can give many other examples. The selectivity reveals extreme hypocrisy. If there was time, I would go through the very interesting history of how Holocaust denial became a crime. In fact, just briefly speaking, at a time when it was possible to save Holocaust victims, to save survivors. There was almost no interest in doing so. Explain it if you like. Years later, when Holocaust victims could be exploited as justification for persecution of others, then it became a big issue. That's exactly what troubled people like Israel Shafak. It's a pretty cynical story. On the point about the propaganda, you're right, it's not a contradiction. It's, two things are true. In the construction of propaganda, there is an effort to impose beliefs and attitudes. But a separate question is how effective it is. That's just a distinct question. It certainly has an effect. There's plenty of evidence for that. On the other hand, there are cases where people resist it. And the manner of resistance is pretty interesting. It's not a topic that's well studied because studies are carried out by intellectuals and they don't like studies about themselves. So the nature of intellectuals is very much an unstudied topic. But there is evidence, not overwhelming, but there is evidence that propaganda is mostly effective among educated people. It's the more educated that tend to be more susceptible to the propaganda systems in which they participate. Now, it would be a good topic to investigate. Right now, there's only limited evidence pointing in that direction. But if it's true, it wouldn't be too surprising. For one thing, they are the purveyors of propaganda, and it's normal human behavior to, you can all find it in your own personal histories. It's normal to start to believe what's convenient to believe. You profess some ideas, attitudes, and end up believing them. That maybe you're a 6-year-old child stealing a toy from your younger brother, and your mother comes in and starts censuring you, and you tell your mother, I didn't steal it, he gave it to me, it was really mine, and so on and so forth, and you probably end up believing it. That's pretty normal, and among educated sectors who are developing and presenting the doctrines of power and domination, they tend to believe it pretty much. It's very hard to profess something and to know you're lying, let's say, so you tend to find a way of justifying it, end up believing it. I think that mechanism's real, and it probably does lead to the conclusion that has been noticed in political science studies of polls, that the educated apparently tend to be more susceptible to propaganda than the uneducated. If that's true, it would be interesting and worth investigating. And there are very interesting cases of resistance to propaganda on the part of the public.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we rush through the last? Or no? Where is Gilles? Should we go through the fourth segment? It's big questions with not much time. That's the problem. Okay. Okay, go to it.
Okay. You seem to be a strong believer in progress, including during the last decades. You mentioned, for example, the fact that it would have been unthinkable 40 years ago to have a black man and a woman compete for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party in the United States. But is that more important than the huge social regression that you also emphasize? You also compared the events in Egypt and in Wisconsin, saying that in one case there is progress of democracy, and in the other effort to try to stop what is in effect a regress of democracy. But isn't the US society the one towards which all democracies tend? A complete control over our life and thoughts by private corporations and media. Dictatorships provoke reactions, but democracies seem to be a much more efficient tool of social control. What makes you think that one could go beyond that sort of society? And finally, how do you square your optimistic views about progress with the ironical word of Bertrand Russell that you approvingly quote? I quote Russell now. After ages during which the earth produced harmless trilobites and butterflies, evolution has progressed to the point at which it has generated Neros, Genghis Khans, and Hitlers. This, however, I believe, is a passing nightmare. In time, the earth will become again incapable of sustaining life, and peace will return. Hard to consider this as an optimistic view about progress.
The fact that the threats to our very survival are so acute and real adds to a certain puzzlement of many admirers of your work and thought. They deplore that you have almost always been very reluctant to respond to those demands that are often put to you regarding what and can and should be done, and that you typically won't answer them beyond generalities such as organized. One could argue that these requests are both legitimate and strategically important, and moreover, that your socialist libertarian ideals should inspire you some answers. Answers that could today, for example, put on the agenda the takeover of workplaces as a live option. So those answers would of course be tentative and modest answers, but they would nevertheless be answers, and I think they are much needed today. You seem to think otherwise. Why?
Okay, first of all, take say Russell's words. I think you're right. They were ironical, as you say. I understand those words of Russell to be very much in the spirit of a declaration that he put together with Albert Einstein in 1955, in which they called upon the people of the world to face a choice that they said is stark, dreadful, and inescapable. Shall we put an end to the human race, or shall mankind renounce war? That was their call to the people of the world. And at least I understand this phrase, which in fact I quoted, as you say, as being essentially the same point, but put sardonically and ironically, meaning you better follow the call that we issued, or else that's what's going to happen. At least that's my interpretation of it. But that's neutral with regard to optimism. And in fact, I'm not actually a believer in progress. I think there's evidence for progress, the kind that I talked about, including the last decades. And I think I'm not a great admirer of Obama or Hillary Clinton, very far from it. But I do think it's important that in the United States, finally in 2008, it was possible for the first time to have a woman and an African American be the two candidates for one of the political parties. Incidentally, this is a case of the cultural backwardness of the United States as compared with the Third World. In the Third World, it's not unusual. In fact, in, say, Uttar Pradesh, which is a country, 100, 200 million people, big, has to be a state, big as many countries. There's the chief executive officer is a Dalit woman. The Dalits are, the untouchables, the lowest caste, the woman, actually, at the bottom of the social scale. Not long ago, she would have been, cleaning toilets or something like that. So she's the chief executive. That's a level to which the United States can only barely aspire. We're nowhere near that. And that's not unusual in the Third World. So here's a case of, cultural relativism, where I think the Third World is way ahead of us. We have a lot to learn from them. And I do think that progress in the case of the United States would be moving towards the level that has long ago been achieved by Third World societies.